In previous chapters, we examined perfect competition and monopolistic competition. These two market structures are pretty similar. In them, firms produced until their marginal cost was equal to their marginal revenue, and because there were low barriers to entry for new firms to enter the market, this entry would result in profit being competed away in the long run to zero long-term economic profit. Now, this chapter, the type of market structure we're going to study is oligopoly. And this is a market structure in which there are a small number of independent firms. They're going to compete with each other. Now, because the competition is slightly different in oligopoly markets, it's going to require completely different tools to analyze. So we're not going to use the type of supply and demand graphs that we use for perfect competition, monopolistic competition, and even monopoly. Now, there's two reasons why these previous tools we used aren't going to work for oligopolies. First, in oligopolies, these firms are large, and they know that their actions have an effect on one another. So for a firm to be successful, they're going to have to constantly be aware of what other firms are doing, and they'll tailor their strategies to what their competitors are doing. The second is that barriers to entry exist, so this prevents new firms from entering the market and competing away those profits to zero. Before we analyze how oligopolists behave, it's useful to know what firms and what type of markets we're discussing. So now, a useful tool to identify the type of market structure that we're going to study in this chapter is what's called the four-firm concentration ratio. Now, this is the fraction of an industry's sales that are accounted for by the four largest firms in that industry. Economists, a good rule of thumb that economists use is that four-firm concentration ratio of larger than 40% indicates an oligopoly is present, because those firms tend to have so much market power that they're influencing the choices that the other firms make. Although there are limits how useful the four-firm concentration ratios can be, they're a useful tool in discussing the concentration market power within an industry, and they give us a good basic idea of whether there is a lot of competition taking place in the market. Here's a table from your textbook that shows examples of oligopolies in retail trade and in manufacturing. If you look at the four-firm concentration ratio for, say, discount department stores, there's 97%. So almost all of the sales in this industry, or in this case, the discount department stores, are being accounted for by the four largest firms. So this example, which is very clearly an oligopoly, these firms are constantly forced to anticipate and to react to what the other firms are doing in their industry. Four-firm concentration ratios are a good first look at competition in an industry. They can give us a quick and easy to find number to say if it seems to be competitive or not. Remember, above 40% indicates an oligopoly to economists. But they have some weaknesses. So the four-firm concentration ratio do not include the goods and services that foreign firms export to the United States. They are calculated for national markets, even if the market is really local. And third, the definition of a market is tricky. Walmart and BJ's, for instance, are in different markets, but sometimes compete against each other to some extent, because there's an overlap in the goods and services they offer. I think number two is especially important. Even though the national market, it may not seem to have much competition, if there are four firms competing in like every locality, even if there's only four firms overall, there's still pretty vibrant competition because those firms are forced to react to each other. So in that case, they won't have this type of market power that you assume with just four large firms, just looking at the market nationally. Remember, in perfect competition or monopolistic competition, when there's a chance to earn an economic profit, firms will enter that industry and begin competing because they have that chance to profit. But with oligopolies, we don't see that happening, and that's because of barriers to entry. So things that keep new firms from entering that industry, in which firms are earning an economic profit. So there's three main barriers to entry that we're going to talk about that cause oligopolies. The first example is economies of scale. Remember, that's a situation when a firm's long-run average cost falls as the firm increases output. This can make it difficult for new firms to enter the market because new firms usually have to start small, so they're going to end up having greater average costs than established firms. So it's going to be more difficult for them to get. If economies of scale are relatively unimportant in the industry, the typical firm's long-run average cost curve will reach a minimum at the level of output that is a small fraction of the total industry sales. The industry will have room for a large number of firms and will be competitive. In the figure on the right, that's represented by the first long-run average cost curve for competitive industry. Now, if economies of scale are significant, a typical firm will not reach the minimum point on its long-run average cost curve until it's produced a large fraction of industry sales. In that case, the industry will have room for only a few firms and will be an oligopoly. And you can see that in the long-run average cost curve, number 2 in the figure on the right. If it takes a large firm, relative to industry size, to achieve economies of scale, the market is more likely to be an oligopoly. So using this idea of economies of scale, we can explain why there's much more competition in the restaurant industry than in the music streaming industry. Because very large restaurants do not have significantly lower average cost than smaller restaurants, the restaurant industry has room for many restaurants. In contrast, a large music streaming firm, things like Spotify or Pandora, have much lower average costs than would a small music streaming firm. And this is partly because a large firm can spread the high fixed costs of streaming music across a large number of subscriptions being sold. Another thing that causes oligopolies is the ownership of a key input. So if control of a key input to producing a good or a service is held by one or a small number of firms, it will be difficult for additional firms to enter. That will serve as a barrier to entry, maintaining the high profits and maintaining the oligopoly. Some examples are Alcoa, remember from the monopoly example, the bauxite they used for aluminum production. Even after other firms were able to recycle aluminum and use that for aluminum production, there's still a small number of firms that are able to compete in the aluminum industry. Other examples, De Beers. Again, once they lost their dominant monopoly, they were still only competing against a small number of firms, so there's still a high level market concentration. And finally is Ocean Spray. For cranberries, even today, 65% of the cranberry crop is controlled by Ocean Spray. So they have a large control over the key input into whatever cranberry products. The final reason we'll cover for the existence of oligopolies is government-imposed barriers. So governments may grant exclusive rights to some industry to one or a small number of firms, which gives them market power and prevents, other firms from entering. One example is occupational licensing laws. It restricts the number of whatever licensed occupation. That is, so dentists, doctors, all the way down to massage therapists and hair braiders. Another example is patents, the exclusive right to use a product for 20 years. And the final one is tariffs and quotas imposed on foreign companies, which prevent them from competing against American companies. Atlantic City, New Jersey used to be a beach destination for much of the East Coast. However, once airline travel really picked up around the middle of the 20th century, people began flying to better locations, places like the Caribbean or Miami. Because Atlantic City lost a lot of the business they had from people coming to enjoy the beach, in the 1970s, New Jersey allowed gambling in Atlantic City. And Atlantic City was protected from competition by laws against casino gambling in neighboring states. So if you wanted to go to a casino, if you were in one of the neighboring states, Atlantic City was really your only option. Eventually, though, other states began changing their laws and allowing casinos. By 2014, most of the neighboring states had allowed casino gambling. So Atlantic City, over time, they lost that barrier to entry. So they were initially maybe a monopoly or an oligopoly competing against Las Vegas and maybe a few other places with casinos. Over time, more and more states began allowing casinos, so those barriers to entry were being reduced. And they went from being an oligopolist now to maybe being in monopolistic competition. Unlike perfect and monopolistic competition, oligopolists are large relative to the market, so their actions from one oligopolist make large differences for the profits of another oligopolist. So a graphical analysis of one firm's actions will not capture the nuances of an oligopolistic market. So instead of using these graphs, instead of using supply and demand, marginal revenue, marginal cost, oligopolies are best analyzed using a specialized field of study within economics called game theory. So game theory was developed back in the 1940s by economists, mathematicians, social scientists, usually credited to John von Neumann and Oscar Morgenstern. The basic idea of game theory is we're studying how people make decisions in situations in which attaining their goals depends on interactions with others. So in economics, we'll use this to study the decisions of firms and industries where the profits of a firm depends on interactions with other firms. So in all games, whether we're talking about things like poker, chess, Monopoly, interactions among the players are crucial in determining the outcome. Now, games share three characteristics. The first is rules. These rules determine what actions are allowable by players. They limit the players to certain actions. Number two is strategies. The strategies that players employ to attain their objectives in the game. They're ways they go about reaching their objectives. And the third is payoffs. So these are the results of the interactions among the players' strategies. So now for an example, we can model the firm production as a game. So there's rules, the production functions, and the market demand curve. There's strategies. These are the firm's actual production decisions, how much to make, where to price. And the payoffs are the firm's profits. Game theory can be kind of tricky to understand, and since we're not in an in-person class where I can gauge how well you're following along, and we can go in depth to answer any questions in live time to make sure everyone understands this, I'll just kind of give a brief example, an overview of game theory, how it will take place, how it will work in the oligopolistic market. This is not something that you're going to have on the test, but it is something still important enough to cover and to show you basically how these oligopolists are making their decision. So let's suppose there's two firms competing in streaming music service. We have Spotify and we have Apple. So both Spotify and Apple have to choose their business strategy, the actions that a firm takes to achieve a goal. That goal might be, maximizing profits. So let's assume that each firm can charge either $14.99 per month for their service or $9.99 a month for their service. Now, the combination of the strategies that both of these companies choose is going to determine the profit. So above, in the payoff matrix, it shows how Apple chooses a price, how Spotify chooses a price, and for each of those combinations, how much profit each of them earns. Let's look at this from Spotify's perspective. If you're Spotify, how are you going to play this game? How are you going to choose to price your product? So if you're Spotify and Apple charges $14.99 a month, you earn a $10 million profit by charging $14.99, and you earn a $15 million profit by charging $9.99. So you're going to prefer to price it at $9.99, earn a greater profit. Now, if Apple charges $9.99, you earn a $5 million profit by choosing to price at $14.99, or a $7.5 million profit by charging $9.99. So in this case, you're also going to prefer $9.99. In this case, charging $9.99 if you're Spotify is what we call a dominant strategy. This is a strategy that will be the best for a firm no matter what other strategies firms use. So think about it. If Apple chooses to price at $14.99, Spotify is better off charging the lower price. If Apple charges $9.99, again, Spotify is better off charging a lower price. So no matter which one Apple chooses, Spotify is going to be better off choosing the lower price. Now let's look at it from Apple's perspective. How would Apple choose to play? Well, if Spotify chooses to price at $14.99, Apple will earn $10 million in profit by charging $14.99, or they'll earn $15 million in profit by choosing $9.99. So again, Apple will charge $9.99. If Spotify charges $9.99, Apple will earn $5 million in profit by charging $14.99, or $7.5 million in profit by charging $9.99. So they're also going to prefer charging $9.99 if Spotify charges the lower amount. So charging $9.99 a month is a dominant strategy for Apple as well, because no matter what Spotify picks, Apple earns a greater profit by choosing the lower price. So both firms charging $9.99 is what we call a Nash equilibrium, a situation in which each firm chooses the best strategy given the strategies chosen by other firms. The firms don't have to have dominant strategies in order for there to be a Nash equilibrium. Their strategies just have to be the best responses to one another's strategy. So again, this is very important that they're taking into account what the other firms are doing. even though both firms choose to price at $9.99 a month, both firms could do better via collusion. An agreement among firms to charge the same price or otherwise not compete. If both firms agreed to charge $14.99 a month, they could both earn more profit than if they acted independently and charged the lower price. This is the reason why collusion is against the law in the United States. You can see why firms might be tempted to collude. Obviously, they can earn a greater profit if they choose to cooperate instead of competing against each other. Their profits would end up being higher. However, in practice, it's often difficult for firms to collude because, as you see, each one has an incentive to cheat on that. If Spotify would collude with Apple, they'd agree to charge a high price, to charge a $14.99. Spotify could then drop their price to $9.99 and earn that $15 million profit instead of a $10 million profit. Likewise, Apple could do the same to Spotify. Because they have that incentive to cheat on each other, they end up charging lower prices, which ends up making consumers better. The Nash equilibrium is an example of a non-cooperative equilibrium. This is an equilibrium in a game in which players do not cooperate, but pursue their own self-interest. Many game theorists concentrate on non-cooperative equilibrium, particularly because the law is against cooperation among firms. Those firms aren't able to cooperate with each other. They're not legally allowed to. It's more interesting to study non-cooperative games. If we allowed players to coordinate their actions in a game by forming alliances or agreements, we'd be looking for cooperative equilibriums. This is an equilibrium in a game in which players cooperate to increase their mutual payoff. These are also interesting games to choose, especially determining when people will defect and what punishment mechanisms one party can put on another party to try to prevent them from breaking away from the agreement. And this might make sense for studying social interactions. So groups of people may often try to cooperate with each other rather than working independently. Economists and game theorists refer to the situation of Spotify and Apple that we went over in the previous few slides as a prisoner's dilemma. Prisoner's dilemma is a game in which pursuing the dominant strategies results in non-cooperation that leaves everyone worse off. Had Apple and Spotify colluded together and charged a higher price, they both would have been better off, earning higher profits. But because the way the incentives work is they can earn a higher profit in each instance by charging a lower price, they both end up charging a lower price and making themselves worse off than they could be. Now, the name prisoner's dilemma comes from a problem faced by two suspects that the police arrest for a crime. So I love the show Law & Order, the original series, and oftentimes throughout the series they'd bring in two accomplices, put them in different interrogation rooms, and then begin to question them. And one of the strategies they take is telling them the other person, hey, we offer them this deal that we're offering you. Whoever takes the deal goes to jail for 5 years. Whoever doesn't take the deal goes to jail for 20 years. Both parties are encouraged to cooperate with police and to admit their part in the crime and to give the information on the other person. So each suspect has a dominant strategy to confess, because no matter what the other one does, they're made better off by confessing. On a previous slide, I mentioned punishment strategies for firms that go against the collusion or the agreed upon path. A price match guarantee is one such enforcement mechanism. So it automatically makes a decision about whether to punish a competing firm for charging a lower price. So if Spotify and Apple are initially both charging $14.99 a month, and Spotify decides to lower their price to $9.99 a month in order to increase their profits, Apple could advertise a price match guarantee. So if Spotify lowers their price, you can automatically get a lower price for Apple's streaming product. That's a way to prevent Spotify from lowering their price, to try to chip away at Apple's customer base and increasing their profits. Another method for avoiding price competition is price leadership. Now, this is a form of implicit collusion. It doesn't need to be, planned out by the industry members. But one firm in an oligopoly announces the price change, and other firms in that industry change their prices to match. So as an example, back in the 1970s, General Motors would announce a price change at the beginning of the model year. Because General Motors was the largest, at the time, the most popular automaker in the United States. Ford and Chrysler, two smaller they were somewhat smaller, but still oligopolist, would match GM's price change. So GM was the price leader, basically setting the price for the industry.